In 10 years, vampires will make up for the vast majority of the population, leaving barely 5% of the human race. This creates particular challenges because the vampire's food supply, human blood, is decreasing and rationing is now the norm. There is increasing evidence that vampires without an appropriate blood supply are developing into wild, evil creatures that attack anyone and everything in order to survive. Edward Dalton, a vampire and hematologist who works for a pharmaceutical company, has been working on developing an artificial blood supply to suit the Vampire Society's demands. He is sympathetic to people and sees his occupation as a method to alleviate their suffering. But his perspective on finding a solution shifts greatly when he encounters someone who has discovered a technique to transform himself from a vampire back into a human form. Spoiler ahead, watch out! In 2019, a girl wrote a letter in which she expressed her dissatisfaction with her inability to develop or evolve. She leaves the house to gaze at the sunrise, and when she glances up, we notice her yellow eyes. She is a vampire. As soon as the sun rises, her whole body burns. Then we are shown that the planet is empty throughout the daytime. Because of a plague caused by an infected bat in 2009, a great deal of humanity has become vampires. The human population is decreasing, and researchers have started to look for blood substitutes to keep the vampire population fed, whereas just a few of them struggle for human rights because they are hunted and farmed. When the sun goes down, the world comes to life once again. Vampires appear to live normal lives, such as hanging out or going to work. There's also a hobo vampire seeking blood and threatening a random citizen. He was electrocuted by the cops for it. Meanwhile, our protagonist, Edward Dalton, commutes to work by automobile and the subway. He works as a hematologist at Bromley Marks, a pharmaceutical company and major blood supplier. After passing through security at the entrance, Edward walks by the chambers containing the machines that farm humans, which he dislikes, before heading to his lab. He's attempting to determine a blood substitute, but his most recent attempt was unsuccessful. Afterward, he meets with his boss, Charles Bromley, and his lab partner, Christopher Caruso, a commissioner and an army officer. The commissioner informs them of the findings of the experiment they performed on a death row convict. He was chosen for a study investigating the consequences of blood deprivation. The absence of blood led the frontal lobe of the brain to degenerate completely. His ears grew longer, which was the first indication of this. He gradually transformed into a Nosferatu-like creature, lacking emotion or thought. These creatures are known as subsiders, and they are causing problems on the streets. Only 5% of the human population remains, and if they do not find a replacement soon, they will all become subsiders. Bromley interrupts and takes Edward to his office for a private meeting where Edward ignores the blood-stained coffee he's been served while Bromley tells him his story. He had cancer, but vampirism healed him. His daughter, however, refused to turn and went away. He is aware that Edward, similar to him, has a special affection for people. That is why, in order to save the human race, they must begin testing immediately. Edward returns to his lab and discusses this with Christopher, who, following some hesitation, informs that the substitute has worked on a monkey, indicating that it is time for them to move on from animal testing. Moments later, the researchers begin the test, with Bromley and several officers watching through a glass. Edward gently injects a substitute medication into the person's body, who initially feels okay, but once the entire dose is administered, he pukes and begins convulsing, with horrible blisters appearing all over his body. The researchers instantly hold him down and inject him with epimony, which stops his shaking and heals the blisters, but his entire body explodes seconds later. Later, Edward leaves the office and heads home. He is watching the news in his car, reporting chaos over blood rationing plans, when he detects something odd meanwhile touching his ear. He adjusts his camera mirror and examines it. His ears have begun to get longer. This distraction prevents him from seeing the car approaching from the opposite direction. He manages to avoid hitting it at the very last moment and stops his car, while the other car collides on a fence. Edward rushes out to assist and gets an arrow to the arm. The passengers stepping out of the car are humans, and their captain, Audrey Bennett, holds a crossbow to protect them against vampires. When they hear police cars arriving, Edward emphasizes that he is only trying to help and suggests that human beings get into his car, which they do unwillingly. Edward sets up the car's daytime protection driving mode, which turns all of the windows black and then removes the arrow from his arm as the cops approach. Audrey discovers Edward's ID badge and finds his occupation as he lies to the police officers about where the humans escaped. After the cops have left, the humans exit the car, and and Audrey wishes Edward a happy birthday while they all exit. Moments later, Edward arrives at home. Then he has a surprise visit from his brother, Frankie Dalton, whom he hadn't seen in months since he joined the army. Frankie feels they should celebrate the birthday, so he purchases an expensive bottle of 100% pure human blood. He pours 2 glasses to mock his brother for drinking pig blood, but Edward declines. This enrages Frankie, who brings up an old argument. Edward does not deal with human blood, but he does work for a firm that farms humans, which he regards as a necessary evil in order to discover an alternative. He does, however, disagree with Frankie's hunting of humans for the army. Edward grabs the bottle of blood and begins pouring it into the sink, but Frankie grabs it from him and smashes it over the wall before attempting to leave. Then he meets a subsider in his direction. The creature enters the kitchen and begins licking the blood from the walls before moving on to the glass on the table. Frankie captures a knife from the holder, startling the subsider and causing it to push him towards the wall. He falls upon a glass table and becomes unconscious after a few seconds. The subsider then comes towards Edward, who holds it away using a stool while screaming out his brother's name. Frankie wakes and grabs the knife. The brothers work together to combat the subsider. This allows Frankie to slash it several times before killing it. Moments later, the police arrive to take over the case, noting the fact that the subsiders had now relocated to the suburbs. One of the cops discovers a ring on the being, which leads Edward to believe it is a local gardener. She also discovered self-inflicted wounds. The next morning, a security alert wakes Edward up. He goes to check, and when he turns on the lights, he notices Audrey pointing a crossbow at him. She informs him that they've been seeking trustworthy vampires and suggests they require his help to discover another option, aside from a substitute. She also offers him a sheet of paper having a map on it. Edward is distracted by a noise and looks around, enabling Audrey to leave. When he investigates the noise, it turns out to be Frankie, who questions Edward about the woman. Edward answers that it's nothing. Later that night, the news reveals investors withdrawing their human resources from Bromley's. Edward goes to work and talks to his boss to request a promise that the substitute will replace the requirement for human labor. Bromley responds that while the mass of the populace will be content with it, a small percentage will always demand the real thing. Edward doesn't go back home in the morning. He puts the light protector on his vehicle and follows the instructions into the countryside, where Audrey awaits him and instructs him to approach a large tree. He moves in the tree's shadow and gets out of the car after putting on his hat and sunglasses. He meets an elderly man named Lionel Elvis Cormack, taking care not to step into the light. This man was a vampire, but he is now a human. Edward wants to inquire about how he became a human, but they are interrupted when Audrey approaches, held at gunpoint by Frankie. Edward attempts to stop him, but Frankie refuses to listen. An army support is already arriving. Audrey pushes Frankie into the sunlight and joins the other men. They take Edward's car. They are chased and fired at as they drive away, causing holes in the car's dark covering. Audrey initially manages to hide them with her hands, but she discovers too many, and the camera is also shot. Lionel takes over the steering wheel so he can observe the road through a hole, while Edward hides from the light. When they reach an unpleasant bridge, Lionel races as fast as he can to cross it safely. They park the car close to a river, and Lionel tells Edward his story. He used to work on daytime modifications for vehicles and owned one of the first shops in town that made them. Daylight driving is fantastic because there are absolutely no other drivers within reach. But it may also be risky. That is what happened to Lionel. He wasn't feeling great given that he hadn't fed, so he accidentally smashed his automobile into the river railing. The crash threw him out of the vehicle, and he caught fire before dropping into the river. When he emerged from the river, he was human once again. Lionel and Audrey want Edward to replicate these situations safely. When Frankie comes to Bromley's office, he is glancing at a few images of his daughter. Bromley congratulates him for reporting the incident and informs him that if Edward returns promptly, no formal charges will be filed. Frankie agrees to do anything Bromley requests of him. At the same time, Edward and human beings are returned to his car, heading for their safe place. Audrey cuts her hand and pours the blood into a cup for him to consume. He initially refuses, but Audrey wants to know that all of the human beings are going to be safe around him, so he agrees and sips the cup. A few hours later, they arrive in an old vineyard, wherein Edward meets other humans, including Jarvis, who is leading a team of rescuers in search of more people. After reaching home, he meets Senator Wes Turner, a vampire politician who supports human rights and is pursuing a cure. Then we see a coffee stand at a subway station, where a guy complains that his coffee doesn't doesn't have enough blood. The staffer informs him that 5% is the maximum she is permitted to serve, but the man is not going to take it for an answer. He grabs the blood bag and, after breaking it, soaks everyone surrounding him, driving them into chaos. People attack the coffee stand in an attempt to grab more blood, leading authorities to show up and electrocute the suspect. The following morning, while in the vineyard, Edward pulls blood from Lionel to perform tests while asking him questions regarding how he experienced the day that he became a human being. Edward believes that the only method to treat the blood is within the body by managing the daylight burn. Most people walk away from him. Audrey arrives to explain to him that the others may fear him, but they believe he can help. Edward admits that he didn't wish to turn, but Frankie misled him and did it anyway. Edward discovers the fermenting tanks, and after Audrey confirms that they are indeed airtight, they step inside to inspect. The tanks include air extractors that can put out a fire, and Edward decides to utilize them in the experiment, so they begin working on the appropriate adaptations. Following that, in the darkness of the night, we see Jarvis' gang on the road, leading a group of rescued people to the vineyard, which includes Bromley's daughter Allison. When a shot causes a flat tire, they end up having to stop their vehicles. They come out with their guns prepared, but the army surrounds them, and after a brief shooting exchange, all human beings are knocked out. However, Allison manages to make contact with the vineyard prior to passing out, and when Frankie steals the walkie-talkie from her, they make use of it to monitor the call and locate the vineyard. At the vineyard, everyone is putting together their belongings and getting into their motor vehicles, ready to move to a safe place. However, Edward would like to stay there given that there will be no other opportunity to repeat the experiment, so Lionel and Audrey decide to accompany him. Back at Bromley's, Allison awakens in her father's office, grabbing a knife as he approaches her. Allison asks to save her friend's life, but Bromley claims he is pleased that he can see her, but as he hugs her, he confesses he is unable to assist her friends. Allison pushes him aside and rushes to the door, but she is knocked unconscious by a soldier while Bromley discovers the girl has stabbed him. Now in the vineyard, the testing is ready to begin. Audrey will be watching the monitors while Lionel will remain in the tank with Edward, who currently has a heart monitor attached to his chest and is wrapped with a wet blanket. The technique is easy to understand. They create an opening in the tank to allow sunlight to burn Edward. Then they utilize the air extractor to bring down the flames. The first two attempts fail, but they let Edward burn for sufficient time for the third, which works. Edward eventually regains his humanity. Their happiness is cut short when the army arrives to raid the location, but they escape by hiding in a wine barrel. We return to the company, this time with Frankie seeing Bromley, who continues to be cared for his wound. Bromley requests Frankie to do something for him, and Frankie exits the room to visit Allison in her cell. Despite her refusal to be turned into a vampire, Frankie bites her. Back in the vineyard, the group exits the hiding place after ensuring its safety. Edward steps outside and is shocked that the sunlight does not hurt his skin. Meanwhile, in the company, Bromley notices that all of his equipment is now empty prior to checking upon his daughter, who isn't drinking her blood intake. Bromley enters the cage and sees that she keeps biting herself, which will cause her to mutate. She attacks and blames her father for every mistake before being dragged away. After the military declares martial law in order to combat the subsiders in the streets. Now we are moved on to Edward, Audrey, and Lionel arriving at Turner's cabin, having to learn that all of the humans have died. Audrey is losing hope, but Edward thinks he knows who can assist. Then we see how the military is bringing the subsiders out into the sunshine for execution. Allison is among them, and seeing her die forces Frankie to think about his position. Later that night, Christopher arrives at his home, where the trio is waiting for him. Edward reveals to him that he knows a better remedy than the substitution and requests his assistance in recreating the trial. The phone rings, interrupting their conversation, and Christopher exits the room to answer it. When he takes too long to return, they begin to check on him, so Audrey rushes to find him, while Edward and Lionel investigate his phone. Christopher had left his cell phone up on a call the entire time, so now the company knows exactly where they are. The army arrives unexpectedly, knocking Audrey out and capturing her, but Lionel and Edward escape down the subwalk tunnels. They decide to conceal themselves in an old abandoned garage, but get caught by a subsider. Frankie arrives and kills the monster before discovering his brother has transformed into a human, forcing him to admit he only changed him to avoid seeing him die. He confesses he made a mistake and wants to help. However, when Lionel approaches, his thirst surpasses him, and he immediately jumps onto the man, biting him. Edward grabs him and throws him away from Lionel. He's about to shoot his brother, but then he notices something. Moments later, we witness Edward willingly enter the company building, causing alarms due to his humanity. Security captures him and sends him to Bromley's office, where Audrey is bleeding on a chair chair while Bromley sipping her blood. Edward betrays Audrey by telling him that he regrets everything and wishes to become a vampire again. Bromley informs him that they have finally found a substitute, so he no longer needs Edward and he considers him a coward. Edward claims Bromley is also a coward, given that he was unable to turn his own daughter. Bromley is furious and bites Edward, but Edward does not mind. In actuality, this has always been his intention. As a result, Bromley begins to transform into a human, and Edward, remembering Frankie's transformation, explains that drinking treated vampire blood is the treatment. Bromley hits an alert to call up security. Then we see a group of army trucks approaching the parking lot. When the troops exit their vehicles and approach the elevator, the doors open to reveal Bromley chained to a chair, leading the vampires to go crazy and feed on him. Meanwhile, Audrey and Edward, armed with weapons, proceed downstairs and are about to escape the building when more soldiers come to block their route. At that moment, Frankie drives Lionel's car inside, hitting the soldiers in his effort to save his brother. But support arrives immediately, and they are now surrounded. Frankie suggests Edward leave before he sacrifices himself, causing all of the soldiers to rush to eat him. Edward has no time to mourn his death, given that a security guard has kidnapped Audrey and he has to save her. He tracks them to a security room where Edward and Audrey, after some struggle, manage to murder some vampire guards. Then they watch on security cameras as the soldiers who fed on Frankie turn human, and the other vampire soldiers assault them as well. A feeding battle occurs, and by the point that Edward and Audrey return to the lobby, just a few human troops remain standing. Christopher arrives and shoots some of those soldiers, claiming that there is no cure. He is ready to fire at them too, then all of a sudden, an arrow strikes his chest and kills him. The arrow was from Lionel, who had arrived to offer help. Audrey hugs him as Edward observes his brother's body, and the rays of the morning sun slowly make their way inside. The movie concludes with the trio leaving in Lionel's car, as Edward informs us that they now possess the cure and are able to bring everyone back. It is not too late. We really hope you enjoyed today's recap of the movie Daybreakers. Please leave a comment below on what you loved about the movie and why. Be sure to like the video, and please don't forget to support our channel by subscribing so you don't miss any amazing content. Until next time, light, camera, action. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.